now I'd like to call Susie Russell from the North East Forest Alliance.
So, my name is Susie Russell. I'm with an organisation called the North East Forest Alliance, and I'm speaking for the Bioregions that cover South East Queensland and Northern New South Wales. And I first saw old growth forest in 1992 when some friends took me out to see some forest, and I realised then that I had never seen old growth forest. And I then had the privilege of going to the bush with a scientist by the name of Harry Recker, who, as we stood in front of a huge old tallowood tree, said to me, this tree is probably about 1,200 years old, and when it falls over it will take another 1,200 years to decompose. And I realised that the time scales of what we were talking about with the forests were so long, so awesome. And I could not believe that we as a society were still cutting down these trees. So I felt then that I needed to stand up for the rights of the forest, not only to exist but to thrive and to evolve.
Can you tell us a little bit about your forest region and why?
So the forests of the bioregions that we're talking about are some of the remaining tall eucalypt forests and rainforests left on the Australian continent. So those areas, when you look at the maps outside, you'll see that really they are scattered around down the east coast and in the southwest corner of WA. In the bioregions I'm talking about, there are so many different species of eucalypts that they qualify to be recognised under World Heritage. But neither of the governments at the state or federal level have bothered to pursue that. So that we have some rainforests in the area that have been qualified as World Heritage, but again, the area could be greatly expanded, but that hasn't happened either because there's no government interest. There are so many species that are endemic to these areas that are found nowhere else that this area is known as a global biodiversity hotspot. There are only 36 of them around the world, and this is one of them. So, like the Great Barrier Reef, it supports a huge amount of life, which is unique and really precious. And one of the most important things that I have found in my journey with the forests is to understand that the values of the forest increase as the forests age. So, old trees provide shelter to species that can't survive without them, particularly because of the tree hollows that don't form often until the trees are hundreds of years old. They provide a root network that acts like a giant sponge and an underground reservoir that supplies water to creeks during dry times. It's old trees that act as carbon storehouses, and older trees are less fire prone. They also provide more shade and are usually cooler, and therefore there's less fire hazard. They tend to produce more nectar, which is a clearly important food source for lots of animals. And of course they also provide more wood.
And can you tell us about the current state of your forests and the nature of many of the forests that they face?
Well, the current state of the forests is really that we are looking at a process where modern forestry is converting old trees to young trees. So when you look at the maps outside about how much forest is left, and there's about some 60% of the forests, 55% still remain, while only about 30% of the woodland in those regions still remains. But the maps are misleading because most of that forest has been severely degraded. So most of the old trees are gone, and as you can see from some of the photos that are going through, they're still going. So the photos there of the giant stumps, they were found only a couple of weeks ago, so it's sort of incredibly depressing to think that this process of converting old trees to young trees that don't have the habitat value, that don't have the water retaining functions, instead dry out the land, that process is still going on. So clearly we've got a major problem with logging, and of course what happens then is that the animals that depend on those forests can no longer continue to exist in those areas. And I just want to particularly mention the koala, because the koala is of course an iconic Australian animal, but many people don't realise they actually prefer larger trees. Up to about 80 centimetres is their favourite. But 80 years ago, koalas were being killed and their skins were being exported by the millions. Millions of koala pelts were exported around that time. And so here we are now in 2016 with an estimate by the Australian Koala Foundation of less than 80,000 koalas alive nationally in Australia. So we're seeing this animal continue to decline. Its habitat is still being destroyed. And of course the effects of climate change are as yet unknown, but we know that it is drying out areas, that we're looking at forest stress, we're looking at increased insect attack, increased disease, increased risk from lightning strike and severe and catastrophic bushfire. And of course, we've got governments that are propping up the logging industry. The government-run Forestry Corporation is promoting and continues to take a lot more wood than these forests can supply. And big companies like Boral Timber have contracts that keep getting extended. The latest extension was till 2028. And so the forests are unable to cope, basically, with the pressures that are being put on them.
And what is it that needs to happen to protect these forests?
Well, I think one of the things that has become known to us really only in the last few months, have I seen information about it, is the amazing science now about the connectivity, about the some of the sort of features, if you like, about forest communities. It's much more than just an ecological community. We know that forests communicate. We know that forests nurture their young. We know that forests warn each other, trees warn each other about predators. So we know that we have evidence that we're talking about a living community. And I think after hearing Gloria speak, that one of the main things that needs to happen is that, as she so beautifully said, we need to build that connection again, where the traditional owners are in a role, managing the forest, where Mother Earth is the guiding principle. So what we would like to see is a series of laws that are there to protect the earth, to protect the forests. We'd also, of course, like to see the laws that allow for the damage, and the Forestry Commission and the exemption from the biodiversity laws to be repealed.
A little bit of time for a question, if that's all right. Does any of the panel have a question, please, or a comment?
Yes, thanks. Am I right in interpreting what you're saying, that you were mainly talking about what's happening on public forests? I'm just wondering about if you have any information about the state of the forests on private land, because there's a lot of our remaining forest is on private land as well. So I think, are there similar conservation concerns about the condition of the forest that's on private land?
Look, all of the damage that is occurring on public land is being replicated on private land. So, with the exception, I suppose, that there is even less regulation, if that's possible, on private land. That there have been lots of long-term logging approvals granted across this region. Northern New South Wales has the highest concentration of private land logging, I think, of anywhere in Australia. So the issues about private land are very serious, but they are also very difficult to deal with in terms of a public campaign, because when you're talking about thousands, tens of thousands of private landholders who think that they have a right to the trees and cut down the trees, and anyone who comes along and says no they don't, obviously you immediately set up a very antagonistic relationship. So we're interested more in government leading the way by stopping logging on public land and then providing serious money and incentives in terms of connectivity and recognition of how important forests are, the rights, the role that they play in our water supply, to encourage people to stop trashing their forests on private land.
Thank you. Did you have a question, Benno? Yep.
Yeah, thank you, Susie. I'm intrigued in a kind of cultural identity context of why non-Indigenous Australia seems to have imported this state of mind of if you can chop it down, and if you can dig it out of the ground, do so and export it overseas. And you talk to Europeans and you know, they flattened and clear-felled that whole continent. And they're absolutely aghast when they see these beautiful, priceless and majestic forests in Australia that are knocked down for wood chips, etc., and land clearing essentially for corporate industrial forestry, essentially in planting monoculture crops. So being on the driest inhabited continent in the world and really having a concern about why is it that you know, forestry and logging gets this special status in terms of primary resource exploitation and the carve out in the EPBC Act. I'm just wondering if you have any, aside from, you know, the slick lobbying of those particular industries, if you could elaborate on that at all.
Big question. Look, I think it has to do, I think there's an inherent racism involved where it's about shutting out First Nations peoples from the forests and the lands. I think it's about we as a society having lost our connection with nature so that people don't see the impact of what's being done. We don't have the kind of education that enables people to appreciate the values of forests. You'd think it would be a pretty fundamental thing to be talking about particularly the role of forests in our water supply, and yet this really basic necessity that we depend on is not really discussed during our education. And I think that it comes from this, personally, that it comes from this sort of Judeo-Christian man will dominate, you know, white man with beard will dominate the land, and that the idea that we would care for the land is seen as somehow associated with women, with weakness, and real men have axes and chainsaws and bulldozers, and so there's a lot of cultural overlays that back up this process of getting out there in the machines and digging stuff up so you get more stuff.
What a fantastic question and what a great answer. Thank you so much. Give it up for Jess.